Okay, so today we're diving into a situation that I think a lot of people don't really think about that much, but is actually becoming increasingly relevant these days. And that's how to navigate life after a breakup
Yeah.
when you're still living with an ex.
Yeah. It's a tricky one to navigate both practically and emotionally.
For sure, for sure. And we're tackling this topic today with an advice article we found from FemCoach, which is a relationship advice website. And what's really interesting is they had this comment thread that I felt like added even more layers to the conversation.
Totally. Yeah.
So we'll be diving into both of those today. But ultimately, what we're aiming to do is give you some real practical advice and relatable experiences that help you go beyond just surviving this kind of situation.
Absolutely.
But maybe even like thriving a little bit.
Yeah.
So you might be thinking, living with an ex, like that's never going to be me.
Right.
But the thing is, it's more common than you might think.
It really is. I mean, the article opens by talking about how there are a growing number of couples who are facing this situation.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And it's for a bunch of different reasons, too. Financial constraints are a big one.
Right, I bet.
Legal complications, or even just the sheer cost of living these days. Like, it's just, it's a reality for a lot of people. And it takes a toll emotionally, for sure.
Yeah, well, and I mean, reading through these comments, it's clear that people are hurting.
Definitely.
They're trying to figure out how to move forward from this situation they're in. And honestly, it's just, it's a lot to unpack.
It is. It's a lot. And it really highlights why having some kind of roadmap, some key takeaways can be so valuable in a situation like this. Absolutely. So we'll unpack some of that expert advice and see how it stacks up against those real world experiences. But one thing I found fascinating was how much these comments revealed about the deeper emotional needs that are at play here.
Oh, interesting.
Like that need for security after a breakup.
That makes sense, though, right? When you're already feeling really vulnerable and uncertain about the future, it's almost like you're clinging to what's familiar.
Totally.
Even if it's ultimately causing you more pain.
Exactly. So let's transition to the expert advice that's offered in the article and see what strategies this relationship coach, Beth Lynch, suggests for not just surviving this kind of situation, but potentially even growing from it.
I'm ready. Let's hear it. So what I'm hearing is like, it's not just about the practical stuff, right?
No, not at all. It's definitely deeper than that.
It's about like a whole mindset shift.
Exactly. And, you know, that's not always easy to do.
Oh, for sure.
But she really emphasizes this idea of transitioning from like this romantic partnership to more of a roommate dynamic.
Right, because you're sharing a space, but you're not sharing a life anymore.
Exactly. And with that comes the need for some really clear boundaries.
Okay, so when we talk about boundaries, I immediately think like chores, splitting the bills.
Yeah.
But it sounds like it's probably a lot more nuanced than that.
Oh, yeah. It definitely goes beyond just who takes out the trash. It's really about creating that space for yourself, both physically and emotionally.
I see.
To heal and to kind of reclaim your individuality.
Okay, that makes sense.
So, for example, Lynch talks about respecting each other's privacy. And not just like knocking before you enter their room, but also emotionally, right? Like avoiding those little things you used to do as a couple.
Like, what kind of things are we talking about here?
Well, it could be anything from, like, cooking dinner together to just sitting down for, like, a casual conversation after a long day.
I can see how those little moments could be so loaded.
Right.
Like, they're full of memories and expectations. And it's just going to make it harder to move on if you're constantly reliving those things.
Exactly. It's not about being cold or cutting off all communication.
Right.
But it's about being mindful of the fact that you're not a couple anymore.
Yeah.
And then she also had some really strong opinions about bringing dates home.
Okay, so when you're living with your ex, she's saying, like, no dates at the apartment.
Pretty much. And I know that might seem unrealistic or even impossible for some people, right?
But it goes back to that idea of creating a safe space for healing.
I see.
And that could be really tough to do if you're constantly being reminded of your ex's dating life.
I'm picking up on this theme of control, too.
Yes.
It's almost like when you go through a breakup, so much of your life feels out of control. But establishing these boundaries, even in small ways, can maybe give you back a little bit of that.
Exactly. That sense of agency, even in a situation that you didn't necessarily choose, can be really empowering.
It's funny because I always thought of boundaries as like kind of this negative thing, like you're putting up walls. But it sounds like it's actually more about self-preservation.
Absolutely. It's about prioritizing your own well-being.
So it's not just about avoiding an awkward run-in with your ex and their new flame in the kitchen.
It's about taking back control of your space,
Yeah.
both physically and mentally,
Exactly.
which makes a lot of sense. And then on top of all of that, she also talks about the importance of external support,
Yes.
like leaning on friends, family therapists, support groups.
Whatever you need.
Because even with all the best advice in the world, this is still probably a very emotionally charged situation to be in.
For sure. And that's where hearing from people who have actually been there can be so valuable.
Okay, so we've got the expert advice, but now I want to dive into these comments.
Let's do it.
Because we've got this treasure trove of real-life experiences.
We do.
And I'm curious to see how those line up with what Beth had to say. So let's jump into these comments. I'm dying to hear about these real-life experiences.
Me too. Let's start with Corinne's story. She's going through a divorce, still in love with her husband, and they're living together with their 2 young daughters, mainly because of financial constraints.
Oh, wow. That's a lot to deal with.
It really is. Talk about a heart-wrenching situation.
Yeah, it's tough because on one hand, you have the practical realities of the situation, like they literally can't afford to live separately.
Right.
But then on the other hand, you have all these intense emotions.
Exactly. And she talks about how painful it is to still be in love with him while trying to move on with her life, all within the same house.
It's like she's grieving the loss of her marriage while still living with the person she's letting go of.
It's a really complex grief, and it highlights why those boundaries we talked about are so important.
Totally. Creating that emotional space, even when you're sharing the same physical space.
Exactly. And then we have Christy, who seems to have a slightly more, optimistic view.
Okay, how so?
Well, she actually seems to think that living with an ex can be doable. She even jokingly refers to her ex-husband as the spawn of Satan.
Oh, no.
But then she goes on to say that they have really clear boundaries and they're able to communicate effectively.
Interesting.
Oh, Chris.
So it's almost like if you have those structures in place, it takes some of the emotional charge out of the situation.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And again, it really echoes what the expert was saying about boundaries being key.
It's like that common thread throughout all of this.
Yeah.
Then we have Blake's story, which kind of adds a whole other layer of complexity.
Okay, what's that?
Well, he talks about how his ex was very codependent and even attempted suicide when he tried to break things off.
Wow, that's really heavy stuff.
It is, and it just goes to show you how emotionally charged these situations can be.
Absolutely. And I think it highlights the importance of approaching things with sensitivity and seeking professional help when you need it.
Which is exactly what Blake did. He and his ex went to couples counseling.
Oh, wow. Not to get back together, though, right?
No. He said it wasn't about salvaging the relationship, but more about navigating the breakup and the shared living situation in a healthy way.
That's actually really smart. It's like they recognized that they needed help figuring out how to coexist peacefully, even if they weren't going to be a couple anymore.
Exactly. And I think it's a good reminder that therapy can provide you with tools for communication and healing, even if the relationship itself doesn't work out.
Absolutely. It's about personal growth, ultimately.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. As we're talking about these comments, I keep thinking back to those emotional needs we discussed earlier.
Yeah, the need for security control closure. It's like they all come into play here.
It's almost like a perfect storm of emotional vulnerability.
It is, but the thing is, even in the middle of all that, there's still hope.
I agree. What gives you hope?
Well, we see people finding ways to cope. They're setting boundaries, seeking support. They're not just surviving, they're finding ways to move forward.
That's so important to remember, that even though this is a difficult situation, it's not impossible to get through.
Exactly. And you're not alone if you're going through this. So many people are right there with you.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
We've covered practical tips, real-life experiences, and even touched on some of the deeper emotional needs at play in this situation.
Hopefully it's given our listeners a lot to think about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if you're out there navigating life with an ex, just remember, you're not alone. And even though you didn't choose this situation, you can choose how you move through it.
That's right. Prioritize self-care, seek support, establish those boundaries. Even small steps can make a big difference.
Couldn't said it better myself. And with that, we'll catch you all next time for another deep dive.